Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weeb Union, and in this one we have significant developments, a major crisis for the Ukrainians in the Kursk region, as the Russians have managed to capture approximately 48 square kilometers within the region within 48 hours. The Russians have also managed to advance within the city of Toretsk in the direction of the Pokrovsk defensive lines, in the northern and southern flanks of Kurakhove, in the direction of Velika Novosilka, and in the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line. The most developments have taken place in the Kursk region, where the Russians have made a new offensive, the third Russian Kursk counteroffensive. Let's start out in the Kursk direction, where the Russians have managed to advance twice here in the northwestern parts. North of Vremivka, the Russians have managed to capture several forest lines and forest patches in this direction, reaching the outskirts of the settlement of Kurakhove. And with this, the Russians have made significant advances west of these settlements following the capture of Novaya Sroshina, Orlovka, and Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians launched counterattacks to regain some positions in this direction, and they have generally been very active here in the forest patch area. Now that the Russians have captured half of them and left the supply line of the Ukrainians very shallow between the forest area and Novaya Soroshina, the Russians are now operationally encircling what remains of the Ukrainian forces in the north. This will allow the Russians to secure the remaining forest patches and the settlements and push onwards towards the remaining settlements along the river line and towards Malaya Luknia, which is an important stronghold of the Ukrainian forces in the Kursk region. At the same time, the Russians have made significant advances in the northeastern parts as well, where they have managed to capture the settlements of Ruskoe Porechnoe and Cherkaskoe Porechnoe. Both of these settlements are important ones here in the northeastern direction. It allowed Russians to continue offensive operations towards the intersection here northwest of Suchia, cutting off some of the supplies moving onwards towards Malaya Luknia, leaving only a off-road supply road to Malaya Luknia, which will significantly limit the supplies of the Ukrainians in that direction. An assault by the Russians from the western direction will completely encircle the Ukrainian forces in Malaya Luknia. Therefore, their positions is now in a very difficult state in the northwestern parts of the Kursk region. And at the same time, it also opens up for offensive operations by the Russians in the direction of Marshanovka, which is another important stronghold of the Ukrainians in the Kursk direction. If the Russians are able to properly capitalize on their gains here in the northern parts of the Kursk region, they'll be able to completely collapse what remains of the Ukrainian positions in the northern parts of the Kursk region to gain control over the northern flank of Suchia and allow the Russians to push the Ukrainians into a small part of the Kursk region before finally putting them out completely from Russian territory. The Ukrainians are attempting to hold on for as long as possible, specifically for January 20th, which is the goal that Zelensky officially announced. A few weeks ago, he said he wanted the Ukrainians to hold their positions in the Kursk region until January 20th, which he claims is the Russian deadline to recapture the Kursk region. If the Russians are able to capitalize on their current gains and the current objectives, they'll be able to capture or recapture the entirety of the Kursk region prior to January 20th. This means that the Ukrainians have to act now if they want to salvage the situation, either by withdrawing their forces from the region or launching some counterattacks to establish their positions, securing their flanks and supply lines towards Malaya Luknia to then develop further offensive operations in this direction. This would require significant reinforcements, otherwise they'll have to simply hold on as long as possible, potentially withdrawing to better defensible positions and launching local counterattacks to improve those positions in their flanks, to secure the supply lines and establish positions that are better defendable. Now that the Russians have limited the supplies of the Ukrainian forces, they need to withdraw from the forming pocket here northwest of Malaya Luknia and establish Malaya Luknia as a frontline settlement, where they have to protect all of their flanks now that the Russians have advanced on both the left and right flank of the settlement. All in all, the situation is very critical for the Ukrainians in the Kursk region, and they may see their loss of the region within the next few weeks. The Ukrainians are so far blaming these advances on North Korean soldiers being used on these offensive operations, to which there is no confirmation so far. Moving on to the eastern front line, the Russians have advanced within the city of Toretsk, but I've managed to capture a few streets here in the eastern parts near the stadium, moving further towards Krimsk, which is the final defensible position of the Ukrainians within the city itself. The northern industrial zone secures the northern flank of Toretsk and prevents the Russians from moving onwards to the western outskirts of the city and gaining full control over Toretsk. In turn, the Russians are also fighting over the fortified positions of the Ukrainians south of Toretsk. Moving on to the Pokrovsk section of the front line, the Russians have advanced northwest of Shevchenko, reaching the outskirts of Pishyane from the southern direction, while also moving towards the river line here west of Shevchenko, and they are also advancing along the river line towards Vremivka from Toretsk. The Russians are here moving towards the western flank of the city of Pokrovsk, towards the supply lines of the Ukrainians moving through the highways and railways in the western flank of Pokrovsk. If the Russians manage to gain control over these fortified positions, they'll be able to significantly limit the supplies going into Pokrovsk and the usage of Pokrovsk as a supply hub, and it will also allow the Russians to start a siege of Pokrovsk, limiting the supplies, which also limits the defensive capabilities of the Ukrainian forces in the area, especially considering the importance of Pokrovsk and the size of it, as well as the fortified positions surrounding it. A lot of Ukrainian forces can be concentrated in this area. Limiting the supplies limits the amount of forces the Ukrainians can commit to the defense of the city, and will make it easier for the Russians to gain full control of it and less costly for them to do so. It will also increase the casualties the Ukrainians would take in the defense of the city if they lack artillery shells, drones, or manpower to defend it properly. So far, heavy fighting is taking place over the defensive positions of the Ukrainians and the western flank towards the supply lines. In the northern flank of Kurakhove, the Russians have advanced towards Shevchenko, west of Sarytony, following the capture of the settlement. The Russians are now fighting over the fortified positions of the Ukrainians on the eastern outskirts of the settlement. This will allow the Russians to gain a foothold within it. However, there are several defensive positions of the Ukrainians north of Shevchenko, which the Russians will likely look to flank from the northern direction, either from Sontsivka here in the east, or from Soria towards Slovyanka in the north. This means that the main focus of the Russians will likely came from the northern direction, from Sontsivka and Soria, rather than their push from Starytony. This is likely to redirect Ukrainian defensive capabilities from the northern direction to the eastern parts. If the Ukrainians leave a gap here in the east, the Russians can flank them from the rear and cut off their supply lines. If they move their forces to the northern direction, the Russian forces would be able to enter the settlement from the eastern parts. Therefore, the Ukrainian positions here to the west of Sarytony within Shevchenko is in a very difficult state. Same with Slovyanka and Vremivka, which will all be under Russian attack fairly soon. The Russians have also made advances south of Kurakhove in the direction north of Vremivka, capturing some forest lines, moving along, flanking the fortified positions of the Ukrainians northwest of Vremivka. At the same time, they've managed to gain control over the majority of Kostiantynopolsk here to the west of Vremivka, gaining full control over the southern bank of the Sukhyali river line. At the same time, the Russians have made advances east and west of Selenivka, where they are looking to gain a foothold in the southern parts of the settlement, gain control over the Sukhyali river, and move upwards towards Oroslev in the northwestern direction. The Russians are looking to gain full control over the southern bank of the Sukhyali river line and then move towards Konstantinopol as well as Oroslev. This will allow the Russians to have a strong flank in the eastern direction as they move towards the settlements that act as the main supply route towards Kurakhove, or what remains of it under Ukrainian control, as well as flanking the fortified positions of the Ukrainians on the western direction, while at the same time the Russians are attacking it from the eastern direction and the northern direction. This will allow the Russians to attack the fortified positions of the Ukrainians from 3 separate directions as they move towards the Dnipro region. At the same time, in the Vremivka Ledge direction, the Russians have advanced further in their foothold across the northern parts of Makarivka. According to the latest reports, the Ukrainians are attempting a withdrawal from the settlement in this very tight passage between the Russian forces in the western and eastern directions, which will likely lead to a lot of losses for the Ukrainians. This will allow the Russians to gain control of this, then move on towards Toretsk, flanking their Ukrainian positions to then sell that settlement as well, and then move onwards towards Neskushne, reaching the village agglomeration of Velika Novosilka from the southwestern direction, as well as moving along the fortified positions to gain control over those in the western parts of Vremivka, cutting off the supply line from the western direction. Finally, in the southern parts in the Zaporizhia direction, the Russians have managed to advance north of Nesteryanka as they continue offensive operations towards Novoandrivka to cut off Orikhiv from the villages here west of Kurakhove: Cherbyaki, Melicherbyaki, Stepovo, Lobkova, and Pyatatki. All of these offensive operations launched by the Russians simultaneously across the front line shows the increased offensive capabilities of the Russians over the past year, starting out fairly slow, mostly undoing the Ukrainian summer offensive gains, capturing Avdiivka and then moving on towards Pokrovsk, to now launching Pokrovsk, Kurakhove, Velika Novosilka, Zaporizhia, Toretsk, Chesev Yar, Kursk, Kupiansk, and Liman offensive operations, as well as Borova, all at the same time. The Russians are launching offensive operations in the northern section of the front line, in the eastern section of the front line, and in the southern section of the front line, launching several offensive operations all across the front line, some more successful than others, some in larger scale than others. If all of the Russian offensive operations were as successful as the ones near Pokrovsk and Kurakhove, near Vuhledar, whoever is commanding this section of the front line really excels at the offensive operations compared to any other Russian commander. And if the Russian army was based on merit, whoever was commanding this section of the front line would command the entire section of the front line. But again, Russia's largest enemy in terms of military capabilities is its own corruption. The assassination of Prigozhin actually led to a lot of work being done to remove corruption, get rid of corrupt leaders, and so on, being completely undone as no one picked up the work after him. Berusuev, the new Russian defense minister, has worked a lot to remove corruption within the economic parts of the military of defense, but not in terms of nepotism and other reasons why completely unfit Russian commanders get roles that allow them to command large units despite them being completely and utterly foolish. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.